Mr. Dugan, friends, it's a real pleasure to be here tonight. I consider Missouri to be my adopted home. When I retired in 2016 from the University of Missouri St. Louis, I went down a list of all 50 states and said, where should I retire? I can go anywhere I want. Social Security, Missouri State Retirement, they'll follow me. And I thought, I'm gonna stay right here. I like this state, it's a beautiful state. I drove over this afternoon from my home in Baldwin, following Highway 100. If you've ever driven it, it's a wonderful road. Scenic, but you dare not take your eyes off the road or you'll end up in the ditch. So, what I'd like to do is to give you a little backstory to start with. I'm not going to spend the whole evening with a PowerPoint, but I want to share with you the story of how this book came to be, Crossroads of a Continent. And to do that, I want to share with you the convoluted way that historians work, at least this historian works, to get here. So, a little bit of background, I call A Life with Trains. And here is the cover of the book. It's actually a Wabash poster, which we doctored a little, but we put the full poster in the book itself. So you can see where it came from, published last year by Indiana University Press. Now I grew up in Greenfield, Indiana. I was born in North Carolina, but I grew up in Greenfield, Indiana, and literally the spirit of St. Louis ran through my backyard. Not the plane, but the train. And every day I could see this beautiful train and many others on their way to St. Louis or from St. Louis to Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and New York. And so I was imprinted for my earliest memories with something to do with trains. And if that wasn't enough, my North Carolina grandfather worked for the Atlantic Coastline Railroad in Wilmington, which was the headquarters of the railroad at one time. Now, I went back to Greenfield during COVID, nobody was around. It was like a ghost town, but this is where the tracks ran. It's called the Pincy Trail. I was really saddened to see what had happened to that glorious double track main line linking Missouri and the states of the East. But I always enjoyed dabbling in railroad history. It wasn't the way I was trained at the University of Michigan, but it was fun, and I liked taking pictures. I never published any of them in the magazines, if any of you read, but I did have a book on the railroads of the Pacific Northwest. This was the first book that I did, and it was kind of addictive. Oh, that was so much fun to do, I'm going to do another one. And so I was at the University of Idaho for almost 20 years, and while there I engaged in archival research and what I like to call history on the hoof, getting out and seeing where things happened. And while I was there, the director of summer session said, I'd like you to give a summer class in the mountains of Idaho on the trail of Lewis and Clark. Now I saw Lewis and Clark trail signs all the way along Highway 100, and this was an interesting challenge for me. But I was able to enjoy camping out with 25 students in the Bitterroot Mountains, and it inspired me to think about how to absorb history by actually seeing where history took place. And I really got into the spirit in my younger days, and really enjoyed that. Well, a company based in New York gave me a call and said, you know Lewis and Clark, could you go on our boats? We do boat trips on the Columbia and Snake Rivers, and we'd like somebody to do Lewis and Clark history. You know, it's all about connections. I didn't know this company, but a friend of mine recommended me, and lo and behold, I ended up making 30-some trips along the rivers of the Northwest and in Alaska. The Alaska part was particularly exciting, and the company's still in business. Lindblad, National Geographic. National Geographic's one of the most recognized names around the world. And I enjoyed this history on the hoof. Well, another connection. When the book came out on the railroads of the Pacific Northwest, the wife of one of my Idaho colleagues, her brother was running this train, and she called me up and said, "Can you do some train lectures on board the American Orient Express?" And I said, "You don't have to twist my arm, I'll do it." And so I made about 30 trips on the American Orient Express across the United States, across Canada, and even across Mexico. And here we are in the first trip, 1995, getting the train service in Chicago. One of the things I enjoyed was taking pictures, because after 9/11, you could not take pictures easily of the railroad infrastructure. They were guards, but I could use the Dutch doors and take pictures off the trains of bridges and any other infrastructure, and nobody ever stopped me. So I put that together in a book that the University of Missouri Press published called Just One Restless Rider, and it's a series of essays on train riding. Another connection, quite out of the blue, it seems like half my life was connections out of the blue. I never sought these things, was a call I got from Phoenix, Arizona to write a history of a large mining company, the world's largest investor-owned copper company, Phelps Dodge Corporation. And they had railroads. And so I was able to get on the property and with their permission to take a lot of pictures of the trains, some of which are behind closed walls, and you have to finagle a little bit to get in there. And one of the things they did is sent me to El Paso, where they refined the waste. It's really a strange term for this, but the copper waste into gold. And inside there is a very pristine locomotive from the El Paso and Southwestern, which was the Rock Island's connection to Los Angeles and the West Coast. Again, literally doing history on the hoof in Jerome, Arizona, one of their closed mines, but which they talked about when I was there reopening. And this resulted in a book that the University of Arizona Press published. Well, every book that I've done in the last 20 years or so, I've tried to finagle some railroad pictures in. I search the archives, find the pictures, and stick them in. And especially if I could get it on a cover, I thought that was really neat. And then this book was done after I relocated to St. Louis using the archival resources of the St. Louis Mercantile Library. And that's how we come to the present book. How did it originate? Once again, I was contacted. I didn't contact anybody. The contact came out of the blue. A St. Louis real estate developer named Ed Boyce, who also owned a train, a dinner train here in Missouri, asked three of us if we would write a history of Missouri railroads. That he wanted an overview that could appeal to railroad enthusiasts as well as non-railroad enthusiasts, people who just would be interested in the history of Missouri as it laid out in the state's railroads. And so we agreed to do it. Unfortunately, Ed Boyce died 3 months into the project. And we, three authors, said, shall we do this? Because we don't have any financial angel behind us now. And we all three, to a person, said, yes, we like the topic, we like Missouri, and we're going to do it. whether we have any financial support or not. Well, unfortunately, the young guy in the trio, Peter Hansen, who was editing the manuscript, he was the editor of a magazine called Railroad History, so he had editing skills. He got a brain tumor and died, surprisingly. None of us knew there was a problem, and he lived 3 months after the diagnosis. Well, the problem, this was in May of 2020. Do you remember what May of 2020 was like? You remember wearing the mask? You remember hunkering down at home or scared to go out in a public venue? Well, the manuscript for this book was in his computer in Orlando, Florida. And the only way to save the book was for somebody to physically take a thumb drive and go down there and get it. And my friends in St. Louis said, "You're all crazy. You're crazy to do this." But I booked the Southwest flight to Orlando with my thumb drive, and I downloaded it. And the book is here. But it was kind of scary at the time. One of the challenges that remained was how to illustrate the book. Because if Pete had pictures, I wasn't aware of them. I didn't find them when I downloaded the written part of the book. And so, fortunately, a friend of mine who works at the Washington State Historical Society had put me on to what's called railroad ephemera, timetables, posters, all of that, and I became a collector. I loved adding it to my collection. And so I had all of these pieces of railroad ephemera. And so I said, I will illustrate the first volume mainly from my collection because I don't have time to go out and get pictures, and the archives are not really wanting to see people. Some archives were shut down completely for 2 years, and so I used my collection. Here's some examples of the ephemera. I love this Iron Mountain, the St. Louis Iron Mountain and Southern. This is the Texas Fast Mail, and the mail carrier is riding on the locomotive behind the smokestack. Very interesting creativity on the part of the railroad. This was an example. Whoops. Get it back here. This is an example of some of the colorful ephemera. This was a woman who in 1903 was introduced to the world as the Katy Girl. Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad was nicknamed the Katy. And she was to be the railroad ambassador, if you will, to the St. Louis World's Fair. So the Katy Girl is going to the fair, the Katy Girl's doing this, but after the fair was over, she disappeared. So getting a picture in the book I thought was important. Here's some other, it's unbelievable the amount of publishing that railroads did. At one time, and I have the figures, for 1909, railroads spent more money for paper than for rails. I have a book that's under contract with Indiana University Press called Publishing the Railroad, which will feature 150 of these railroad images and give the story on how railroads became the foremost publisher in the United States, really. These are two from the Missouri Pacific, different ages, but very colorful, promoting Colorado as a getaway during the hot Missouri summer. And Frisco, I just acquired the one on the right about a week ago. A collector had it for sale on eBay, and it was a dramatic image that I'd like to use in the second volume, along with this picture of the meteor to illustrate the second volume. Kansas City Southern, I don't want to leave out the other side of the state from St. Louis. And it's very interesting because they put a map of the route from Kansas City to the Gulf of Mexico. If you've ever followed it in a car, and I've followed parts of it down in Arkansas, it curves quite a bit to the Ouachita Mountains. But here it's straight as an arrow that crow flies. And that was pretty typical of railroad maps. They straighten them out, they straighten the track out. And so I'll end this PowerPoint with this one, which I just learned is out as of Tuesday. I didn't even know that. Look forward to seeing it. So what I'd like to do now is to talk about Crossroads of a Continent with this background. What we tried to do when the three of us got together, Ed Boyce rented a special train in Kansas City, and we rode in the dome car from Kansas City to St. Louis, negotiating the details of this book. How do three people create one book? Now 2 volumes. It didn't start out to be 2 volumes. There's a lot to tell. And as we crossed Missouri at sunset, it was just such a beautiful evening that everything seemed to fall into place. And we actually divided up chapters. Instead of trying to mesh our prose, we just said, you write chapter on the freight handling, I'll write a chapter on the St. Louis World's Fair and the railroads, and that's the way it came out. The goal was to place Missouri's rich railroad history within a larger context, the national context, even the international context. In one of my early years, I taught Canadian history. I probably was the only American who taught Canadian history. No, I know there's some others. And so we added in this North American context and focused on Missouri as the crossroads of a continent, even more so than Chicago, which we argue doesn't have as rich a history as Missouri. The story of Missouri is very different from surrounding states. The railroads of Missouri came much later. Illinois had a railroad 20 years before Missouri. It had an extensive set of tracks before Missouri. Missouri was late to the table. The first spade of dirt for the railroad, which passes right close here, the Pacific Railroad of Missouri, later the Missouri Pacific and now the Union Pacific, was turned in July the 4th, 1851 in downtown St. Louis. The goal was literally to get to the Pacific. It's a case of champagne taste on a beer pocketbook, because Missouri didn't have money to get to Kansas City from St. Louis, much less the Pacific coast. But this was the first railroad in America to use Pacific in its title. It was a grand ambition, and it was a reflection of Missouri's grand U.S. Senator Thomas Hart Benton. Benton had been senator of Missouri since Missouri became a state. He had incredible seniority by the late 1840s, and he proposed this railroad as nothing less than a passage to India. And you might say, India? That's not even on the North American continent. The reason was that there wasn't much between western Missouri and the west coast. And he could not get investors interested in building a railroad in the nowhere. So if he told people, when we get to the west coast, we're going to go to India and China. India was probably the wealthiest country in the world in 1850. So it made sense. The problem was, Benton had a young rival named Stephen Douglas of Illinois. And Stephen Douglas wanted the railroad through the Pacific to go from Chicago, his hometown. Benton wanted it to go from St. Louis. Well, so we have two Democratic senators who are fighting one another over the railroad. Well, it turns out that Missouri had a problem, many problems. But the biggest problem was Missouri was a slave state and Illinois was a free state. And when it came to building a railroad, you need lots and lots of money. And Missouri didn't have a lot of money. So it needed money from the money lenders of New York, New England, and so forth. And as the 1850s went on, the heightened consciousness of slavery caused many of those money lenders to shut their purses. It's like the apartheid situation that some of you may remember from years ago in South Africa, where investors were discouraged from putting money into South Africa. It was the same thing for Missouri. Illinois got bushel baskets full of money to build railroads, and Missouri had to build it on a shoestring. And you might say, how do they do it? Well, loans, state help here from Jefferson City, land grants, but very little hard cash. And so it was a real difficult job to convince people to put money into a railroad across Missouri, even the local folks. People said, why do we need a railroad that goes from St. Louis to Jefferson City when there's perfectly good steamboats going up the Missouri River all the way up to Independence, the jumping off point for the trails further west? Another problem is that a single mile of railroad west from St. Louis, you could buy 2 or 3 first-class steamboats. And St. Louis had built a huge industry based on steamboats. And so it was hard to convince people, if it ain't broke, why fix it? We're doing okay without railroads. The city of Chicago started sending railroads west to intersect the Mississippi River, due west. And those railroads cost about 1/3 per mile of the railroads in Missouri. So you have a state that has all the money at its command, paying 1/3 less per mile than Missouri. Why was Missouri paying so much more? The Ozarks. You went west of Chicago across the Great Plains. It was flat. It was cheap. Here you had to tunnel, you had to fill, you had to build bridges, some of which fell down. Some of you may know the story of the Gasconade Bridge in the mid-1850s. The railroad was sending a special train to Jefferson City filled with dignitaries. They wanted to show their handiwork. And the bridge collapsed, and about 30 people died, including several prominent people. It was the worst possible PR that you could think of. The next year, Chicago railroads, the Rock Island, built a bridge across the Mississippi River at Rock Island. And it was successful for a day or two. It didn't fall down, it got burned down. Somehow a steamboat from St. Louis crashed into the bridge, which was made of wood, set it on fire, and it burned down. And the railroad sued. And they had a young Illinois lawyer named Abraham Lincoln, who was a railroad lawyer before he became more prominent in state and national politics. And they won the case. And so Illinois was making great strides. Once they were across the Mississippi River, Iowa was a piece of cake. It was flat. The soil, some people said, was 12 feet deep. The farmers were lining up to get farms in Iowa. It's quite a contrast to central and southern Missouri. Northern Missouri, yes, it's kind of an extension of the rich soils of Iowa. And the one railroad in the 1850s in Missouri that was successful connected Hannibal and St. Joseph. The rest of them, you couldn't really call them very successful. The original Pacific Railroad, it never got close to the Pacific. It got to Colorado and stopped. That was where the Missouri Pacific ended. The Frisco was also headed for the West Coast, St. Louis to San Francisco. It didn't get any farther than Oklahoma. What happened was that the compass of opportunity moved south into Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Louisiana. That's where the real business was, not trying to get to the West Coast. Gave up that. But the Iron Mountain, for example, St. Louis-based railroad, later on the Kansas City Southern, they all found their opportunities in further south. And St. Louis, by the way, was the premier streetcar building center in the world. St. Louis Car Company, American Car Company. Where did that lumber come from? East Texas and Louisiana. The railroads brought it up, and I could name a whole bunch of commodities that were brought up, and St. Louis beer in refrigerated cars went down to Texas. It was a nice exchange. So nice, in fact, that when oil burst from the ground literally and formed a black plume near Beaumont, Texas in 1901, the sudden wealth of Texans caused them to say, how can we put a civilized finish onto our state? Because it was a rough and tumble state. They went to St. Louis. They hired architects in St. Louis. St. Louis was the place they sold stocks. My wife's grandfather was a St. Louis. I've got some of his stock certificates. They're not worth 2 cents. St. Louisans were very gullible about the possibility of oil and getting rich from Texas oil. In fact, the Chamber of Commerce in St. Louis in the early 1920s warned people, don't pay any attention to these Texas oil salesmen. You're going to lose big time. But her grandfather bought anyway. And so I like the beautiful certificates. They make nice documents. Well, what about this clash of the two senatorial titans that I mentioned earlier? Here's where slavery comes in again. And I didn't force the issue, just to be politically correct. I looked at what the documents told me and went with that. That's how I was trained. And Senator Thomas Hart Benton in 1850 was up for re-election again. I think it was his 6th term in the Senate. And you can't run that many years in politics, and especially Missouri politics, without making enemies. And people said, especially his enemies, he's soft on slavery. I don't think he's the man for the job anymore. And so in those days, the Missouri legislature, meeting here in Jeff City, chose the senator, the U.S. senator. And so the legislature declined to return Thomas Hart Benton to the Senate, who moved into the position as chair of the Committee on the Interior, Stephen A. Douglas. And he takes aim at the idea that St. Louis is going to be the gateway to the Pacific and works to get Chicago, and was successful. If you read the old Missouri newspapers, they are scared of what Chicago is doing. He said, if we don't build railroads, and this was one of the levers that pried the Missourians loose with their money, they're going to amputate our whole commercial empire that we've built all up the rivers. Wisconsin, lead, timber, all that floated down the Mississippi River. The Missouri River steamboats could go all the way to central Montana, believe it or not. Some of you already know that. But they could go to Fort Benton, Montana, named after Senator Benton. It's a city still there, near Great Falls, Montana. And they said, if Chicago keeps sending these railroads across, it's going to, and they use this word, it's going to amputate St. Louis's commercial reach. And it did. It cut St. Louis off from the commerce to the north, and that's why they started looking to the southwest, to Texas, Louisiana. Well, St. Louis became the headquarters for one of the great railroad empires in the United States, run by, some would call him a robber baron, others would say he's an industrial statesman. There's a division in the House, Jay Gould of New York. And the Gould Empire is quite impressive. It included what became the Missouri Pacific, and he had the Katy at one time, the Wabash. It just sprawled out in every direction from St. Louis, and it was very impressive. But he died in the early 1890s, and he left two sons to run his empire, which didn't completely survive. One son was named Edwin, and his ambitions were tempered by common sense. He ran a railroad called the St. Louis Southwestern, or Cotton Belt, and he ran it very successfully. He stuck to his business and never had any issues. But his brother George wanted to be the first person in American history to build a railroad from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It had never been done. Most of the railroads, except for the Wabash and a few others, either were Chicago East, Chicago West, St. Louis East, St. Louis West, Memphis East, Memphis West, and New Orleans East and West. And George was going to use the Wabash as the centerpiece for this transcontinental railroad. St. Louis would be the belt buckle. In Missouri, if you look at a map of the Wabash, it has routes across Missouri up into Des Moines, Iowa, Omaha, Nebraska. It would be the centerpiece, literally the crossroads of the continent. That's where we kind of got the title, thinking about George Gould and his attempt to create the first truly transcontinental railroad. We use that term very loosely in railroad history. There's only, the Canadians have transcontinental railroads. There's a transcontinental railroad, all 48 miles of it, across Panama. But when we talked about the first transcontinental railroad, it was Sacramento to Omaha, and then later the ends were extended. And so George Gould got overextended, and as the records of the day say, he made a lot of enemies along the way, and nobody was there to help him out when his empire started to collapse, and collapse it did, and in spectacular fashion. I'm interested in Gould. I'm too old to write anything about him, but just today before I left St. Louis, the mailman brought me a biography of the Gould family that I'd like to read, because I think he's a very interesting character in the ambitions of the father and then at least one of the two sons. Well, were there any surprises? Any surprises? Yes. We think of St. Louis and Missouri as the gateway to the West. At one time when Senator Benton was in Washington, this was the last state to the Pacific coast. At the end of his career in the Senate, California became a state. But for years and years and years, Missouri was like Cape Canaveral, the jumping off point into space. In this case, horizontal space between here and the Pacific. And the space that was predicted was east to west. But Missouri was also another gateway. And people forgot and forget that it was the gateway to the southwest, to Mexico. On the back of the book, on the dust cover, I have a Missouri Pacific brochure. It's called the Mexico-St. Louis Special. And it's a map of the train going from Mexico City to St. Louis. St. Louis was the gateway to Mexico for a while. I don't know all the details, but I think that Mexico had a consulate in St. Louis to handle the flow of commerce. The Presidente of Mexico for many years was a man named Porfirio Diaz, and he encouraged railroads to be built south of the Rio Grande and south of Arizona. And many people said, well, Mexico is like a drink with 3 straws in it, all of them being sucked upon by Yankees. So there was a building resentment in Mexico against Diaz, and he was overthrown in 1910, and for the next 10 years, Mexico was in a revolution, a very bloody revolution. And the 2 brothers that did the most to create the spark that ignited that revolution were the Magone brothers in St. Louis. And so not only did you have cargo flowing between Missouri and Mexico, and not only did you have vacationers going south to Mexico City in the winter, but you had ideas, revolutionary ideas. And that was the biggest surprise for me. I would love to see somebody write a book just on the Missouri as gateway to the Southwest and Mexico. I'm not the person. At 78, there's not too many more books in me.